Welcome back. Yes, an unprecedented background here. I just got done because I'm sitting waiting for an appointment. I had time to kind of cruise through YouTube, and I came across the most recent video from Eric Weingartner, um, making a statement towards Steve Morris and his ideas. Now, to basically round this up, Steve Morris is arguing that within the port, only a certain amount of the length of the port actually makes it past the valve on each individual valve action. Now, I want you to pay attention. I want you to go back down my list if you're not part of this channel, and look at the design for the Venturi. There's about 3 or 4 videos discussing airflow through a Venturi. Now, in that video, I mentioned the reversion. Now, when a valve is open, okay, it's open for a short window of time for the entire motion of the piston in a 4-stroke engine. Okay. Now, Eric has come out and basically said, in a polite way, because he knows his place, okay, that Steve Morris is saying that the air at the seam, the port entrance from the intake into the cylinder head, that air isn't necessarily sucked into the cylinder itself with each individual valve angle. And I've said within multiple of my videos is that the air that is sucked in, when the valve closes, there's a ramming effect. So the size of your bowl dictates how much air can actually transfer over the valve with each and every action. The size of the bowl also controls the reversion that makes it past the bowl back into the port. So many years ago, approximately 35 years ago, I did testing with mechanical fuel injection and the different velocity stacks, lengths, so on and so forth to figure out exactly what the air is doing throughout the RPM range. At lower RPMs, the air keeps moving in a constant motion. It keeps moving from the ambient air exposure into the cylinder. As the valve closes, there's a ramming effect. Now, as RPM increases, there's more reversion that will reach farther out. But included with that, the higher the RPM of the engine is, the greater the vacuum is on the intake charge. So testing everything from a 20-inch velocity stack down to absolutely no velocity stacks at all, the port went from approximately 3.5 inches to 13 inches, finding the prime length of your intake runner versus the RPM of the engine. Now, that was all duplicated on a 427 big block with rectangular snowflake cylinder head. So the flow was an average of 280 to 290 CFM with your standard 219 intake valve. Now, as we understand, the larger you go with your intake valve, your bowl will typically increase in size also. Okay, easy enough. So there's more of a curtain area to actually expose and let the air through. Now, going to a larger port, let's say going from a peanut port to a large LS6 rectangular port, there's massive amounts more volume for the air to transfer through. But if you actually change those heads on a low RPM engine, say exact same cubic inch, 427, if you're only operating at 4,000 RPM, you're only going to draw in the amount of air that can transfer past the valve during the valve lift and the action. The larger head does not necessarily transfer more air into the cylinder. It reduces the restriction for the air to move into the cylinder. But the timing of the air flowing over the valve and into the cylinder is also dependent on velocity. So Eric Weingartner obviously was kind of debating this, and he drew it all out as best he could within schematics, so on and so forth, trying to do it the mathematical science way to figure out how much air actually transfers in. He does show a good comparison of the air hat on a dyno that can measure how much CFM passes through it. You can also measure the amount of fuel within the air-fuel ratio that is being used during a dyno session. So if you calculate how much horsepower and how much fuel is being consumed, you can calculate how much air is going out the tailpipe. That does not necessarily tell you how much air is moving across the valve during any action of the valve. That's telling you a partial part of the story. Now, the point of this video is that Eric says that all of the air of the intake port comes in contact with the valve seat. So the difference between a three angle valve seat to a 5 angle, or the different radiuses with multiple valve angle or seat angles, all of the air that transfers through the port comes in contact with the seat. No, it doesn't. There's a very short period of time within the lower lift numbers that all of the air that is squeezing between the seat and the valve comes in contact with the seat. As the valve lifts away from the seat, less air makes contact with the actual seat. Now, I will give, kudos to anybody that can do that math. Anybody that can determine how much air comes in contact with the seat as the valve moves away, because it is a constant motion to where less and less air will make contact with the seat. Now, typically the short side, the short turn radius valve seat area, that will make more contact with the air at lower lift numbers. But as velocities increase, less air can make the turn across the short turn radius. There is one thing, the mechanical component, that majority of the air actually comes in contact with, and that's with the valve. Because almost in every single design of a overhead valve engine, more air comes in contact with the valve because it's actually in the flow path of the air. The vacuum is on the backside of the valve. So more air actually comes in contact with the tulip portion of the valve than the actual valve seat. Air only comes in contact with the valve seat at low lift numbers, and it sticks around on a short side radius for a longer period of time. But once velocities increase with either RPM or the increased vacuum, the air path doesn't make time and doesn't have time to be able to make that turn over the short turn radius. So you can eliminate even the air that's making contact with the seat at higher RPMs. So there's multiple variables that go in there, but Eric Weingartner, basically the clickbait that he said is that Steve Morse is wrong. No, he's not. Now, Eric Weingartner also mentioned that the things like flow benches or dynos are a tool, something that just allows us to verify any modifications that we're doing. A flow bench, you're measuring the restriction. And the less restriction you have will transfer to more airflow. Easy enough. But there's a marriage between the volume of airflow and the speed that it's moving at. A engine dyno will also give you is also a tool that will give you a variable number that you can configure. But within the last 6 videos within my listing, I've also mentioned the number of things that are doing torque multiplication or power multiplication through the driveline. So if you're working with a V8 engine, you can take the total output, and that is divided by 8. Each cylinder creating its own specific power. And that number is going to be a variable depending on how efficient each chamber is compared to the next one and the next one and the next one within the firing order. But as the power is transferred from the crankshaft into the driveline, there is multiple steps that can multiply the actual power of the output of the engine. So as I've stated, a 350 horsepower engine can actually feel like you're driving something of 550 or even 600 horsepower because of the torque multiplication through the driveline. A dyno is measuring how much output is actually coming at the crank. And you can do the variables to find the efficiency of how much fuel that it took to create that power. Your air-fuel ratio will tell you approximately how much air is being moved through the air pump to the amount of fuel. So if you can measure how much fuel is being used within a time period, you can narrow down of how much air was used in that same time period. But again, at different RPMs of the engine, either less air is being consumed or more air is being consumed because of the additional vacuum or ram that's being created with the airflow. And more of that air, 90+% of the air traveling through an intake port comes in contact with the valve. And only 10% of the airflow throughout the RPM range may or may not come in contact with the valve seat. So going back to the velocity stacks, the 427 big block Chevy with the 219 valve, if you were to increase to a 2.25 intake valve, you are increasing the area of the valve seat. Easy enough, bigger valve, bigger seat, okay? You're also increasing the size of the port, the throat area of the bowl. Does that necessarily transition to more airflow? It's reducing restriction. Now, going to a bigger valve, does that increase velocities? No, it actually decreases velocities. So even though the window has been increased to allow more air to travel through it, it reduces the air speed or velocities in the port. So there's a trade-off. And then you take into account all the different reversion that might be occurring. Okay, so also, I forgot to even think about this. During the overlap period, when the exhaust valve is open simultaneously to the intake valve opening, the amount of vacuum being caused in the cylinder because of the escaping exhaust gases will actually allow the air coming through the intake port to mitigate to the area sharing the exhaust. So at that point, how much of a radius you have from the seat into the chamber is going to be very vindictive. But in the machine shop world, you can only make a seat symmetrical. So whether it's a 3 or 5 angle valve job, you're fixing a mechanical component to only function in one area, a symmetrical round shape. Now, I was going to create a video today about why the 3-team Poly Chrysler Semi-Hemi did not work. While I was waiting to basically make that content, I seen this video from Eric Weingartner. I was like, there's a perfect example that we can address a couple of different things. We can address the airspeed that is shared between the exhaust escaping and the intake charge. Because of the Semi-Hemi, again, it's moving air in the same direction. In and out, basically within the same direction, and only altering the air path by a little bit. Now, that's not taking into account the amount of swirl or tumble that's created when both valves are closed and the piston is approaching top dead center. It also addressed something else that's been spoken about in the last week as far as spark plug heat ranges or checking the air-fuel ratio on the ceramic portions of the spark plug. One of the reasons why the 3-team Polyhead was a failure to performance was because of the spark plug location. Any of the fuel that was passing through the path of the airflow when the intake valve is open, the fuel goes directly into the spark plug. And as the piston is encroaching top dead center and creating compression, it pushes even more of that fuel into the cavities from the threaded portion of the spark plug into the ceramic, following the spark plug. Now, Steve Morris has come out and said it's very important that you take the ceramic, basically break the spark plug in half and be able to read the marks within the ceramic to tell you if the fuel ratio is rich or if you can lean it out. Depending on the design and how the fuel is being introduced into the spark plug itself is going to vindicate or erase any kind of theories you have, because if you have a spark plug that's facing away from the current of the fuel going into the cylinder, it does not get exposed to the fuel until it's being compressed into it. Okay, so heat ranges, beliefs, and so on and so forth is going to be specific to your compression and your combustion chamber design. The 3-team poly placed the spark plug right in the path of fuel. Same with the more modern day 4.7 liters that are offered either by Jeep, Chrysler, and so on and so forth. That is the reason why they went to a dual spark cylinder head with the 4.7, is because the air-fuel ratio, the heavier fuel, was going directly into a spark plug. And in order to create the most efficient ignition, they had to add another spark plug. Now, there was also some other characteristics within the 3-team poly head that also destroyed its performance capabilities. Not only is the spark plug in the flow path of the fuel, the quench pad is also right above the spark plug. So as the piston is moving towards the cylinder head, the fuel is traveling to the spark plug, but the quench area is actually kicking the air away, separating the fuel from the air. It is not turbulent enough to be mixing it upon the point of where the ignition happens. So that's why the 3-team poly was replaced by other variations that worked more efficiently. Because the actual design of the 3-team poly cylinder head with a single shaft with alternating rockers to actuate the valves is actually a brilliant design. Something they realized with the ball stud Hemi. Now, speaking of Hemis, that's another cylinder engine design that is very specific, because once again, because of the hemispherical chamber, the valves keep the airflow within line, the spark plug being in the very center. But what did the manufacturers find out with that centrally located spark plug and the orientation that it is to the gases being forced up? It pushes the fuel and air charge into the areas of the spark plug. Later variants of the Hemi moved the spark plugs to the side, realizing the fuel would actually tumble and transfer down, right over the spark plug hole, following out the spark plugs. So they moved the spark plugs to the side out of the path of the fuel. Now, obviously the dual spark plug configuration, instead of the spark plug being right directly at the compression, they're also angled to the point where they're not, they're more of a shearing direction than what they are as far as forcing it straight up and down. That was learned through the altered fuel engine combinations, because once again, those fuels are heavier. They're not going to separate as well. So even with the fuel transferring right over the spark plug, it can't necessarily ignite the fuel, because the fuel doesn't ignite. You can take pure nitro and put flame tool it, and it will not ignite. It does carry its own oxygen content, but when you start forcing air into it, like in altered fuel dragsters, the supercharger is increasing the air ratio to allow the alternative heavier fuel more separation to be able to ignite and burn faster. Now, it burns faster and also burns longer, so that as the piston is traveling down, it's burning and expanding at a longer rate. And the intensity of that burn is obviously increased for more horsepower. So again, talking about tools, I'm not afraid to say this, and it's one of the things I've disagreed with Eric Weingartner for many years, is that he himself is the tool. The information that he gives to individuals is only a tool to get them to a certain aspect, to understand a certain thing. But his methods of increasing that horsepower is not accurate to the practices or the technology that has been around for 50 years. In response to that, Steve Morse needs to do a follow-up video. He has the capabilities, the dyno, to actually show the transition of air from, let's say that he puts the cap of the actual dyno hat back on. Seal it off, tape it off, turn the engine over. When the engine will not suck any more air and it creates vacuum, it has used all of the air inside of the dyno hat. How many revolutions of the engine did it take to empty that out? So let's say that the engine turns over 1 revolution. Can the engine consume all of the air that is trapped inside of the dyno hat? So let's say it's 18 inches tall, 12 inches in diameter. If he tapes off the top and seals it and turns the engine over for 1 revolution, so basically just 1 valve action, can the engine empty the dyno hat? No. How many revolutions, say that's just tied in, because it's going to be all 8 cylinders because it's carburetor hat. How many revolutions would it take for the engine to go around to consume all of the air inside of the dyno hat before it creates a vacuum? That's how you'd be able to test. It would take 2 revolutions. Okay, so assuming it's a 565 cubic inch engine, rotated twice. It doesn't matter what size cam profile it is because it's not moving fast enough to create a restriction. It would take 2 revolutions of a 565 cubic inch engine to use the air inside of the dyno hat. The faster the engine goes, the less air that can transfer into the cylinder. So if you were to start the engine and actually ignite and introduce fuel, how many revolutions would the engine spin before the dyno hat would be emptied? It still remains at 2. Now that engine cranking at 6,000 RPM, if they could measure how many revolutions it takes to empty that dyno hat, it would still remain at 2 revolutions. Okay, so again, getting down to the math, what an engine does on a racing strip or a circle is entirely different than what a dyno or a flow bench can tell you. There are so many other variables just within the engine combination that you're not adding in all the different torque or power multipliers within the driveline or the forces working against the power. Because once again, to go faster, it's all about removing restriction. Whether that's within the cylinder head porting, to the weight of the vehicle, the wind resistance, none of that remains fixed. So while the industry uses 28 inches of water to measure it, which is a lower amount than what the actual ambient air temperature is, there's so many other variables that can be thrown in to where Eric mentions 30 horsepower, that he could find 30 horsepower just in the valve seat grinding or cutting. Bogus. And I'm sure he would love to prove that to all of his viewers. Instead of measuring per horsepower for the engine, the efficiency of how much fuel and air can actually move over that 5-angle valve job, because it's exactly the same as a 3-valve angle job. Because more of the air comes in contact with the valve. 90% of the air flowing through a port comes in contact with the valve. The larger the valve, the more area is being contacted by the intake charge. But the velocity of the air traveling over that valve or over that seat is pertinent to additional horsepower. So again, use a tool for whatever information they have that can be beneficial to you, or use the tool where appropriate. When it comes to the science of engine building, we have over 100 years of proof within scientific facts to tell you exactly how air moves. We can try to manipulate it, but it's still going to go where it wants to go and how fast it gets there. Have a good one.